Now let's talk about the Lagos Tenancy Law of 2011. I remember when the law was enacted, people were really excited, especially tenants. But if you go back and forth, the landlords are arguing, the tenants are arguing. But really, what exactly was the law meant to achieve?
First of all, I like to say that law, there's no law that we make that doesn't affect us who make it. I like that to be a message to the public, to understand that every legislation that is passed in this state affects us too. We are not exempt from the laws that we make. In the State Executive Council, interestingly, I have members of council who are landlords, and I have members of council who are tenants. And you would have wished that you were the fly on the wall to listen to the debates, what appeared to favor the tenants and what appeared to favor the landlord. What we sought to do was to provoke a social rethinking about the morals of asking people who receive rent monthly in arrears to pay rent yearly in advance. You're asking them to bring forward what they have not earned in multiples in advance of what they will earn in arrears. And then we sit back as a people and say there is corruption. Financial accounting has two ends. It's a debit and a balance end. So if I give you what I have not earned, does some logic and common sense not suggest to you that I have earned it in an improper way? And so in a vicious cycle, you ask me as your tenant to pay 2 years' rent in advance. I will inflict that cost on somebody. And so it translates to the cost of goods and services. So it's for us now to stand up as citizens and claim ownership of the moral principle that lies within that law, that I will set the first example. Because if you take 2 years' rent in advance, you know what? The system is going to take it back from you. And so it diminishes the quality of life across the board. And you will go and see those countries where weekly rent, monthly rent is paid in arrears, tied to salary, that the quality of their lives are relatively better than those jurisdictions where yearly rent is collected in advance. So that's one. There was a moral challenge to this society. Now, what have we done that hasn't been done before? There have been so many versions of that law. Almost every government has tried to amend that law in a way that it would seem to respond to societal needs, because it shows that all those governments in Lagos State have remained conscious of the challenges of housing and the deficits and also the moral issues that lie in the way that we price and deliver housing. But that said, people who are not lawyers may probably not understand. That law is a self-enforcing law. It's for you and I to now do the right thing. So we don't need anybody to enforce it. It's self-enforcing only in the sense that if we find out, when you bring yourselves to court, if we find out that you have made an agreement that violates the law, the principle is that the law will not lend itself to enforce an illegal contract. You would have made an illegal contract. And therefore, the rights and the burdens of that illegality usually fall where they lie.
Would it be correct to say that the law favored the tenants particularly?
Well, it depends on who is looking. First, there was a social responsibility to protect vulnerable people, and tenants are vulnerable. And any good law that a society makes must respond to that. But there's also the other side, that one of the reasons that we found out for the deficit in housing, and government can't provide all the housing, at least not the way we currently finance things. And that's another debate entirely on its own. But we found out that private sector contribution to housing was also being limited by the difficulty of recovery. And so we wanted to create an incentive for people to also build. And we had to make recovery easier, subject to compliance with minimum standards of law. So there was something in it for everybody.
Why did the law exempt eyebrow areas, for instance, Victoria Island, Ikeja, GRA? Why, some aspects of the law, why were those areas exempted?
The reasons are manifold, but I would address one or two of them. The places where tenants are most vulnerable are not tenants in Ikoyi or GRA Ikeja. The kind of accommodation, the social housing, are usually flats. Secondly, you will find also that there are economic issues there. Companies usually rent those kind of houses, and they want to sometimes do long-term planning. Channels, for example, wants to rent official accommodation for his GM. You don't want to be paying rent every year. Sometimes they want long-term contracts. So we didn't want to disturb that also, because it would be an investment disincentive in our economy. And if you look at every landlord and tenant law that has been passed in Lagos State, I think since 1976, that exemption has always been there. So we didn't invent it. We found it there, and we still see the economic justification for keeping it there.
Okay, quickly, let's talk about the very controversial law, the Lagos traffic law. I remember when it first came out, at some point I was in the middle of going from Ikeja to Okwebi, and I had to walk a long distance. It was just at the point where the law was enacted, and we didn't have motorcycles at that time on that road. I remember I was really upset.
Why were you upset? Because you had to walk.
I had to walk, yes, under the sun. And there was no, like we would say, there was no Okada. There was no motorcycle. So
do you ride Okada in the city of London?
No, you don't.
Do you walk in London?
Yes.
And
but transportation is better.
Transportation is better relatively. We haven't said that we've solved the problem. And again, interestingly, let me say that I didn't just wake up and decide that we should restrict the movement of motorcycles. Since before when I was born, there has been a road traffic law in Lagos. There's a road traffic law in every society that categorizes vehicles, motorcycles, articulated trucks that we call trailers, sets weight prescriptions, sets the kind of roads they can travel on. In the same way that there is aviation law that sets standards. So you can't park an airplane on an expressway because there's a law that regulates how that mode of transportation is handled, the kind of fuel that you use, and so on and so forth, the kind of training that the personnel must undergo, the safety issues. Have you ever flown on an airplane and they tell you, if you flew this morning, don't put on your seatbelt? Have you ever heard that before? Now, there's also legislation for boats on water, safety of life at sea, SOLAS, that's the abbreviation. It's a global convention regulating navigation of vehicles at sea. So nothing extraordinary has happened in a road traffic law. It's been there before I was born. What we did was that we were responding to petitions by citizens of this state, residents complaining about the difficulties that they were having, safety issues, robberies that was being perpetrated by motorcycles that had unrestrained movement across the state. Yes, road transport, motorcyclists have a right to use our roads. They're citizens as well, but they must do so in accordance with the law. So what did we do? Out of 10,000 roads in Lagos, we restricted movement on 570-something roads, barely 5% of the roads. The roads we restricted movements on were highways, expressways, where there was a bus service, where there is a taxi service. So people were not without alternatives. I appreciate the need and the compelling appeal that fast transportation offers. And we will soon have it. And that's why we are building the light rail. That's why we are developing the ferries. But I also understand the losses to human life when those accidents happen and we pick dead bodies. I know the challenge of protecting and supporting citizens who are able-bodied in a challenging environment. I know how that challenge is multiplied manifold when they lose their arms and their legs.
It was argued that the law favored basically the rich and was against the poor and helpless people. What do you have to say about that?
Who are the people who are dying on motorcycles? Were these rich people that were dying on motorcycles?
Not particularly.
So, I mean, what is the basis for this argument? Really and truly. Who were the people who were losing their limbs on motorcycles? Was it you and I?
But if we talk about the penalties for traffic offences.
You know one thing? You know one thing? In Singapore, it's a beautiful country. I don't know if you've ever been there. Right on the plane, when you board, you are going to Singapore, they tell you the penalty for drug trafficking is death. They tell you immediately. Why should I be arguing against the severity of a penalty? Am I going there to go and carry drugs? Why should I worry about the severity of the penalty? Any law-abiding citizen should never worry about the severity of the penalty of any offense if he's going out there to go and do the right thing. But in any event, one of the interesting things, those fines and all of that, if I knew that we were going to deal with it, I would have showed you the record. Our revenues in terms of traffic fines dropped, and that's the way we want it. It means then that we had developed more complying citizens. The cost of law enforcement is higher than the revenues that it brings. Voluntary compliance with law leaves us with much more money to go and do other things. If you pay your taxes voluntarily, you know what it does? It relieves me of the burden of hiring a lawyer to collect the same tax and paying the lawyer, because it would almost net off the cost. So it's cheaper for society when citizens comply voluntarily with any law, because the cost of enforcement of law and order is reduced. And law and order itself is the foundation for development and for prosperity. A lawful society, an orderly society, will be a more prosperous society by many margins.
It appears the Lagos State traffic law is gradually beginning to impact on road safety and standard of driving, in addition to general well-being of motorists in the state, as the governor has revealed that accident rate as well as casualty figures from road mishaps have comparatively reduced. With that, we say thank you so much for being a part of this week's edition of Law Weekly. My name is Victoria Idowu. Please send in your comments on the addresses on your screen. Till I see you next week, make sure you obey every traffic law.